Hey you guys, and welcome back to That Disney Girl. So today we have a really exciting episode for you, and if you watched my video last week you knew it was all about Port Orleans, and when I was talking about Port Orleans I found out that there was a whole fictionalized Disney backstory to the resort, which if you watch my channel you know is my favorite thing to talk about Disney like ever. So that is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. So basically there were actual real newspapers published by Imagineers that were inside of Port Orleans French Quarter, as well as Dixie's Landing Resort, which was what Riverside was before Riverside was a thing. Port Orleans had the Sassagoula Centennial, and then Dixie's Landings had the Sassagoula Times. And together all of these newspapers created such an interesting and very intricate backstory. Probably the most intricate backstory I've seen in the Disney canon for a long time, so I was really excited about that. So I researched all of them, I read every single newspaper, and I decided I had to tell all of you. Now, as a warning, if you're a Disney nerd like me, you're gonna love this because it is such a history-dense backstory. So I decided that instead of just talking about it to you on the camera, I was gonna script the whole thing just to make sure that I got every detail in there and I wasn't missing anything, because I think that this backstory is way too detailed to not give it any justice. And just before we begin, I just want to make sure that I highlight that this is all a fictionalized backstory. So although this is something that kind of sounds like it's taking place in real history, it's not. So don't worry if you hear something that isn't actually what happened, because it's not what happened. It's just a Disneyfied version. So sit back, relax, and let's go back in time. So to tell the backstory of how Port Orleans originated in Disney, we need to go all the way back to 1694. So picture this. You have all of these European countries trying to claim as much of the unknown land along the Atlantic as their own, and then we take a look at France, who is basically just hanging back. Now King Louis is living his best life and indulging in all the luxury around him, but that distraction pulled France away from going into North America. So now let's zoom in on France. A gentleman named John Lane was the best mercantile shop owner from France to England. He was the guy you would go to sell and import goods between the countries. And if you're in England and there's a way to get your hands on some good French wine, you do it. So the high demand in wine from the English allowed John to become quite close with Esteban Michel d'Or. He was a very popular owner of the Chateau d'Or vineyards. The two became closer and closer and believed that North America would be a great place to colonize. They figured it would have some great natural resources, as well as a place where all nationalities could live together. Anyway, in 1964, the two would finance an expedition to go and claim land in the New World. Their sons, Pierre d'Or and Philippe Lean, and yes, when you combine their names it says Orleans, set out on that expedition. So Philip and John had been traveling for about 10 years now, and then they stumble upon the Delta, which led them to the Sassagoula River. They reached land and realized it would be a perfect boat port, and it would really work out well for trading. The land looked fertile, and they could just imagine beautiful boulevards with cute little homes and shops. So flash forward to 1727. Now France has had its hand on the North American territory for the past 23 years, but they've been using their money to protect other lands. So we're back to leaving it to the French citizens to make this dream a reality. So Pierre and Philip decide to team up with René and Robert Bonhomme. These are two French-Canadian laborers who have a very stereotypical French-Canadian last name, but these two Canadians make the dream of cultivating this land a reality. It's basically like the plot of your favorite home renovation show. René comes up with plans for construction, while Robert finds the buyers to finance the project. Within this backstory, we learn that once Port Orleans was vertical, the Satchel Girls arrived. These were basically single women who had nothing but a great outfit and a satchel who wanted to start an adventure of their own. Seems like this was something that was just a filler section in the newspaper to show us that the town was starting to grow. Okay, so it's 1743 and the French government is starting to see how well Port Orleans is doing, and they finally decide to step in, and they name Pierre Poupon governor of the region with his wife Amelia. Pierre was super extravagant, he was personable and very well liked, so he was the obvious choice. And it sounds like Amelia would have been very charming, matching the elegant vibe the budding region was trying to exude. And I say trying because before the Poupons came in, the area was not as chic and quaint as we see it today. It was a little bit shack looking and trying to get on its feet. So the Poupons made sure that Port Orleans had a culture of its own, and by doing that they started by beautifying that culture. I was trying to see if Poupon meant anything in the Disney canon, as most names usually do. There was a character in both DuckTales and Dinosaur, but neither quite lived up to the depiction we see and hear for Pierre. So it's 1763 and our Governor Pierre's sons step in to really help finalize the architecture and the grounds. And just for fun, let's look at their names. They were Gaston and Francois Poupon was actually the name of that French bird from Dinosaur. And fun fact, that bird was eaten by a baby, which is what Poupon means in English, so that's just some fun Imagineering for us to take a look at. But moving on, as soon as that was all done, France sold Port Orleans to Spain for a war settlement. So yeah, all that work for nothing, right? Well, not really. Spain was quite taken by the citizens and the culture of the region, and instead of erasing it, they just decided to add to it by adding some Spanish architecture and cuisine style. I mean, our boy Gaston even married a Spanish local, so it seemed like our original explorers, John and Estefan, were starting to get their dream come true of having a culture join as one. Now in 1827, we start to look at performance in Port Orleans, and Jean-Michel Dessert headed that change. Before loving the arts, he was a sweets lover, which we can clearly see highlighted as an audience in his last name. You know, Dessert, same thing. Once he started focusing on the arts, he erected Palais Dessert, where we received live music of all kind. Music that began on the streets started to take place indoors, marking the beginning of jazz clubs. When looking at the resort, I can clearly see this influenced when you go to Scat Cats on certain nights of the week. You can listen to some live music, imitating Jean's idea, and this is basically the current replica of Palais Dessert. He then married performer Maria Garcia Jackson, and if that name sounds familiar, it's because the resort's gift shop is called Jackson Square Gifts and Desires. The gift shop was originally the theater, which makes so much sense because right outside of that quote-unquote theater, we see murals of people socializing dressed very well, much like you would see at a show's intermission. But after the theater was remodeled, it became Jackson Square's Gifts and Desires, and this is where dresses were sold and made by Jean and Maria's daughters. This brought Paris's high fashion to America and increased trading and exporting due to the new commodity in the region. And like I mentioned earlier, all of this was originally told on a newspaper called the Sassagoula Centennial. And in our backstory, we have a little ode to the creation of sharing the Port Orleans story via paper. Elizabeth Quenta Darnay is another character in this tale, and she began the Sassagoula Centennial in 1835. It had different columns, and no breakfast was complete without the paper on the table telling the region about the previous day's news. She even employed the town's youth to deliver the paper, which would then grow up to be the business leaders and allies of the paper. One of my favorite parts about this backstory is with Mimi Cross. She was an English nurse who loved to bake but also loved children and started an orphanage in Port Orleans. To fund this endeavor, she turned the bottom portion of the building into Cross Bakery. The bakery was very successful and the kids always loved to help out, but there was one in particular who stood out in the baking department, and that was Jacques Beignet. I know you can already see where this is going, right? Well, Jacques opened up his own shop where he made delicious puff pastries called beignets, and today we can still find those mouth-watering desserts at the Sassagoula Floatworks and Food Factory. This little detail is brilliant because it ties in the backstory to something that we can see tangible here today. It makes the story feel even more valid and placed in reality. Now, we cannot do a video on Port Orleans and not explain the giant sea urchin that is the pool. So there were many folk tales told, but one that stuck out above all of the rest. Parents were having a tough time keeping their kids away from the bayou, which was surrounded by Port Orleans. There were many snakes and alligators, and parents did not feel safe. So they created this myth that this giant serpent lived in the marshes and would eat unsuspecting children who trespassed. I mean, that sounds like another horror film, I know, but let's look past that. Many of the older kids, however, did not buy into this tale, so a big old group of dads used fence wires, bed sheets, and made a real-life botched serpent Halloween-looking costume and waited in the marsh. And they eventually traumatized any non-believers. So that wicked-looking eel that you slide down is actually just a bunch of wire sheets and 16 dads protecting their kids. I do like that the serpent looks like a snake, which was one of the things that were said to be in the marsh, and all around the pool there's a bunch of alligators, which was another thing that the parents feared. So when this pool was constructed, it's almost as if they made it so that it was serving as a warning for the resort's backstory. And by using it, you're just being a big rebellious kid. When you walk into the lobby at Port Orleans, I used to think it was a ballroom because of how lavish and elegant it looked. But it was actually a mint, which makes so much sense since this is where you go to give all your money away when you're going on a Disney vacation. Basically, with the changeover from France's currency to Spain's, the new governor Hector created this mint to produce a steady flow of currency and even offered equal currency exchange to Port Orleans residents. And then something happened. the Spanish lost Port Orleans to the French again. Luckily, the mint was able to quickly begin printing francs, and the territory did not suffer financially from this loss. But another tangible tie to this backstory is that the bank would print purple and green coins as keepsakes for visitors during their time there, which is something you can still see today at the resort. There's even a bunch placed in the fountain as if visitors threw them in there to make a wish. Those purple and green coins actually became so popular that the French were able to sell the territory to America and profit largely due to them. And the mint became a bank, but is still seen today as Port Orleans Mint. So Port Orleans belonged to the French, then to the Spanish, then back to the French, and now America. Got it? Okay, let's move on. Now let's chat food. In Port Orleans, we already discussed the diverse population, and with this, plus all of its trading ports, there were markets that had many stands selling specific foods. Apparently, they all used to howl at one-line sales pitches like, "Come and get your tasty baguettes, so delicious you'll never forget." And it was very loud and vibrant and a fun atmosphere. Now, when you walk into the food court, you can see that each area represents a stand and a specific kind of food, and they're all vastly different, just like this marketplace. Plus, in the dining hall section, we can see that there's lively Mardi Gras themes, which is keeping up with the backstory's claim of an energetic atmosphere. Of course, by 1889, the main method of travel out of this territory was steamboat, and within the town, most residents rode down with a horse-drawn buggy, which we can see still both stand today as modes of transportation for the resort. The Port Princess was the official symbol for the city, and it's also the symbol for the resort. And you can still see one of the boats today is named the Port Princess. So, we have discussed Port Orleans French Quarter, but what about the other side? Now, these newspapers were being written while Dixie Landings Resort was still alive and well, and if you don't know much about it, well, this is where Riverside sits today. And much like Riverside, it sits on a bayou and has both colonial and rustic charms to it. Now, let's dive into that backstory. Once again, we have two brothers, J.C. Peace and Everett Peace, who made their way down the river from Port Orleans to claim this unclaimed land. Everett is the brother who really loves the loner life. He likes swamps and took residence in the Alligator Bayou, and he lived like a hermit inside of a tin can house. But J.C. wanted to create an empire, so he bought a cotton mill and erected the first of many southern mansions, which we can still see today as the building facade of the resort rooms. I originally discussed that the resort would become Riverside, but it was still gonna look the same, and although it's never been said why, you can probably tell that the backstory of running a cotton mill would insinuate racial undertones, especially when the man running it was named Colonel Jonathan Colby. I mean, the resort's merch included Son of the South gear, which is one of Disney's most racially controversial films to date. And plus, the term Dixie is a lot less PC today, so they changed the name but sort of kept that rustic theme going on. Now let's get back to the story. So Everett constructed his cabin by the bayou, and over time, the lonely cabin began to instigate rumors. It was rumors of a scary old ogre child-eating man that lived there. This is definitely similar to the sea urchin pool story from French Quarter, and perhaps it was the parents that constructed this one as well. One day, a brave boy built a raft, and he was ready to face Everett and was shocked to find out that he was such a lovely man. The two became friends, and Everett made the bayou a fun place for kids. He even made them wooden toys, and then Old Man Isle became a very popular spot. Today, we can still see it with Everett's house turned into the pool bar and a pool full of oddly constructed toys and waterfalls, but the area was still quite dangerous, and there were animal trappers all around for a reason. Even today, when you head towards that Alligator Bayou, you'll notice that the walkways and bridges are elevated. This was to prevent you from stepping into the swamp and in direct view of alligators. If we look at Everett's diary, he once spoke of a trading post that was set up in Dixie's Landings where all the trappers from the bayou would go to sell their pieces. And that post actually still stands today in the form of a boat rental house in which you can take a pontoon boat out on the water for a spin. So now we know that first, the trappers used this area to do their trading, then Everett made a home that he deemed the area Old Man Isle, but the name Dixie's Landings is all Colonel J.C. So J.C. married a woman named Millie, and they would later build a mill, so that's some foreshadowing for you, you know, Millie with the mill owner. Anyways, the trappers did not want him there as he was not willing to maintain that swamp life, but J.C. was okay with this because he wanted to be in a much drier area and took refuge a little more north in what he deemed as the Magnolia Bend. First, he built the Acadian House, which, as I mentioned previously, can still be seen today, and it was a home that could house many people, much like a resort. He then built the Cotton Mill, which now serves as a dining hall, but its unfinished interior still holds the history of the workers who once operated the mill. Okay, are you still with me? So you might be wondering what happened to the brothers here. We know of Everett and Colonel J.C.'s stories, but they're both separate, and at this point, years have gone by, and they have not spoken to each other or even known where the other was. So let's look at how they were reunited. J.C. and Millie had a daughter who met met a man, and then they had a daughter named Little Susie. So Susie was young, and just like the rest of the kids, she loved to go visit Old Man Isle. When she was there, Everett made Susie one of his very popular wooden toys, a hand-carved bird, and he always signed his creations. Well, Little Susie brought it back home, and shocked by its detail and beauty, her grandfather JC took a look at it and noticed right away that it said Everett Peace. He was so excited to finally find his brother, and he had Susie lead him to Old Man Isle, and the brothers happily reunited. Everett and JC continued to live apart, but traveled to each other's lands often afterward. So Susie's dad was named Buford Honeyworth, and he had this idea to create the Sassagoula Steamboat Company, and he was going to do that right next to Colonel's cotton mill, and this all came to fruition on January 3rd, 1853. Once this was created, Buford sent his helper, Sir Edward Biltwright, to Pittsburgh to go and build another boat right. We all see what the Imagineers did there. So it's the summer of 1855, and everyone is super pumped up because the Dixie Queen is coming down the Sassagoula. But due to a lack of rain, the boat ended up getting stuck. After a few months, the boat set sail again for 10 years, and then that exact boat was actually struck by lightning with half of it disappearing. But Henry LeMarin recycled her timbers and built the boatwright shop that we see today. So let's quickly recap the buildings that are here and the prominent families that lived within. The Acadian House is the main building built by JC and Millie. Their daughter Sarah and husband Buford owned Magnolia Terrace. Town Mayor Franklin Tanner had Oak Manor, and the last were Edward and Betsy Barron, who owned Pater Place, which was actually built by architect Gaston Poupon. As you may remember from earlier, he was the son of the French Quarterside's governor. So now we can see that the two separate towns were actually starting to work as one. In order to stay close to his brother and to allow the kids to safely visit Old Man Isle, JC made bridges along pathways from the Acadian House and all of the others to Everett's Marsh. We can still see these bridges connected today when visiting the resort. After that, we saw Fulton's General Store pop up, bars, which we know today as River Roost Lounge Bar, a boathouse emerge, as we now know today as Boatwright's Dining Hall, originally built by Henry LeMarin, who salvaged that steamboat way back when. And in the end, the city was just as successful as Port Orleans. The two towns actually went hand in hand, as many guests knew Port Orleans as the fun party city and Dixie's Landings as the more relaxing countryside of Louisiana. Okay, so that's it. You are officially a historian of all things Port Orleans and Dixie's Landings. If you enjoyed that video as much as I enjoyed researching it, or if you learned anything new, definitely give the video a nice big thumbs up. Leave a comment on what you thought, or if you have any more information about it, or if any of the names I mentioned have something to do with the Disney canon, you definitely need to comment that down below, because I was trying to figure some stuff out, but I didn't know everything, and I'm sure each of those names that I mentioned had historical significance. And if you'd like to take a look at those newspapers that gave me all of that information, I'm gonna link them down below so you could check those out for yourself. But I think we're all a little bit Disney nerded out, so I will see you real soon. Okay, bye everyone.